Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was June 14th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt cara companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. As I've been working on today's document, I've really just grown in my affinity for it. It opens up a glimpse into a world that I just would not have had any awareness of before this. And it has to do with the particular artisanal activity and the business of a group of people in the town of Berga, which is about 100 kilometers north of Barcelona. Let's talk about the apparatus of the document before I get into exactly what this document is about. It is in one of Violant's registers. It's register 1822, which is a Commune et Curie register. And remember, these are the ones where I'm starting to grow a little suspicious about whether Violant and Joan actually had any participation in the creation of these documents, or if it's just in their name, like as an office of the state. So the addressee is in line 1, and it is the Bailiff of Berga, that town that I mentioned before, and he's named here. His name is Miguel Dardayllo. And then in the probata at the end, which is on folio 153R, we have something very unusual. It's 4 lines, and it's really hard to understand, to be honest. So first we have Père de Pesant, the scribe for Violant that we've seen before. And then we have some Latin abbreviations that are understandable. So we have ex per facta per, meaning made from, and then another pair, which is weird though. So it's like made by the order of, but I don't know why you need to have PER twice. And then after that, we've got another name. It looks like Petrum Olsma, and that's the same person whose name appears after the dating clause at the end of the text block of this document. So it's someone like a vice chancellor or some kind of official that works for Violant. And then after that, we've got these 2 lines where every single, well, maybe not every single word, but almost all the words are abbreviated. And honestly, it's really hard to make out. So I think we've got qui, fuit, and then something like vestry, and then et, and then something in really light handwriting, then down to the 4th line, and then honestly, this is really hard to make out. It was done in less of a thick kind of ink than what I'm used to seeing here. So this could be an R, but not fully written because the ink ran out. I don't know. And then we've got a wormhole, and then we have in, and then I think hoc, and then what looks to be like FOR, and then like a fouet. I have no idea what all that verbiage amounts to. It is pretty unusual, I think. All right. One other thing that I can say is that the probata for the document before this one, on folio 152V, it has ex pro facta pair. So now that I'm looking at that, I can make a change to what I just said. The beginning of the second line of the probata, I think that is a pro and not a pair. But just look at how faint the little loopy is. That is, and part of it is because there was damage that got a repair to it. Someone pasted in paper over that left edge of the loopy that goes through the descender of the P. So that's one of the reasons that was hard to make out. All right, well, ex pro factum per. I think that does make grammatical sense. So it's something like ex pro. Yeah, I don't know that I from memory can just say what that means, but it's, on behalf of, made on behalf of. Can maybe say it like that. All right, there's one more piece around the edges of this document that we have to talk about, which is that at the beginning of the document, which is at the bottom of folio 152V, there's a marginal note. That marginal note, I think, reads nihil quod scriptur domini regis. Now, the quad, I'm not quite sure of. I feel like I have a recognition of that abbreviation symbol after the Q, and that I'm getting it wrong. But nihil means nothing or not. It's a negation. And then the scriptor, it's something like written. So this is not written by the Lord King. Why would you need to write that? I think it's because there's something in the document. There's a mention of the king in the document. And this document takes us through quite a story of a financial dispute in Berga that centers on a particular kind of business. And I will tell you, I had the hardest time figuring out what that business was because of medieval Catalan vocabulary, but I did just want to point out before we move on from what I was just saying that the mention of the king is in line 3. So it appears that the king had given some kind of grant or ruling to the person who appears most in this document, and that had happened. We've got a date in line 4. So 13, oh my gosh, wait, I think that's, 1381. 1381. And I think that this might be referring to when Joan was the Duke of Girona, because if we are referring to the previous king, usually they make an effort to signal that, saying something like the king of, good memory or something like that, or our father, the king of good memory. So I think maybe this is referring to Joan himself before he became king, but maybe not. Not quite sure which king, which person is being referred to here by that phrase, Signor Re, Lord King. And then we've got something to grapple with, which is that there's a marginal note saying that the king did not. So I'm not quite sure what to make of this whole thing. Maybe just like a signal saying that the king has not also written about this right now. But I don't know if they would have gone back and searched through the documentation from 1381 and said, uh-oh, we can't find that, and so it maybe was not written. Which is, they might have done that. We have definitely seen evidence. maybe not in the podcast, but there have been times when the Chancery staff have gone back and looked, oh yeah, I think we did do an episode on this, but I just can't remember which one because we're just way deep into the documents now, where they looked back and they referred to the text of an earlier document. So they were able to access these things. It's not like it was in some big messy pile that no one could ever find anything in. They were organized in some way at the time so that they could be referred back to. I mean, which is the primary purpose of doing all of this, is to create a record so that if somebody contested it, then it was accessible to bolster the case of the court in whatever dispute might have arisen. All right, speaking of disputes, let's talk about what's going on in Berga. There is a fellow named Jacme de Puig. That is a very common name in Catalonia, de Puig. And I think, am I going to embarrass myself here by just doing this off the top of my head? I think it's Hill. Like, it's the last name, it translates to Hill, if I remember that correctly. If not, I'm embarrassing myself again. All right. So Jacme de Puig has had some kind of involvement in this business in Berga, and he's made a complaint. And this document is basically just saying that Jacme de Puig needs to be paid back. There needs to be some kind of restitution for Jacme de Puig. I am actually lost in the details, but it's something like that. And there is a possibility that it's Jacme de Puig that needs to pay. So I'm not 100% on my interpretation here. It is clear that there's been some kind of financial damage because the word dampnaches is used, and it's used toward the end of the document. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines from the bottom on folio 153R. All right, so Jacme de Puig is involved in this business. I've been teasing what this business is. I'm going to do that for just a little bit longer because I want to mention that there are 4 people involved in this whole business, this dispute in Berga, and they're mentioned at various points in the document. So we've already talked about Jacme de Puig. Then in line 5, we have Per de Cortines. In line 7, we have a Bernardo Soldevilla. And then on folio 153R in line 6, we have somebody named Jem Olomer. And so that's a lot of people to try to keep track of, and all of them having some kind of involvement in this dispute. All right. Now, let's talk about what kind of business this is. And this is why I had this growing affinity for this document, because there was a word that I'd never seen before. It's at the end of line 4 of the document at the bottom of folio 152V. And that word is tinyaria. Yeah, tinyaria. Tinyaria. And I had a real struggle with this word because nothing was coming up in the Diccionari Català Valencia Balear. And when I put it into like Google Translate or some other things, it wasn't making any sense. And I will say that the OpenClaw agentic pipeline pointed me in the right direction, because within that output, there was a mention of a dye work, DYE, as in like the dyeing of fabric to put color onto that fabric. And indeed, that's what we're talking about. So if you go to the Diccionari Català Valencia Balear and you type in TINY, then what you get is tint, T-I-N-T, as the definition. So if you are tinting something in English, you are adjusting its color. It's a word for a darkness of a color, like cars get tinted windows, if we're talking about that word in English. But the origin of that word, and you can think about this with like the word tincture, it has more to do with a chemical process. And of course, in the Middle Ages, if we're talking about lightening or darkening something through a chemical process, this was often done with fabric. You could also say it was done with glass. So this tintaria has to do with, I guess it could be glass, but my guess is that it is textiles, because I think we would have another word if glass was involved. So I don't know what that word is, but the fact that we don't have anything about glass makes me pretty sure that we're talking about a whole business that operates around putting color onto fabric. And if it was a glassworks, I think we wouldn't be using the word tinyaria to describe a glass manufacturer. And I'm not sure if they were making glass in Catalonia or if it was all just being imported. That's an interesting question I would like to know the answer to. But basically what we have in this document is a fairly large artisanal business of a dye work, place where what they did for their economic activity in this particular business that I think Jacques de Puig owned was to dye fabric, to add color to textiles. And so we have this, large group of people. We've got this group of 4 people involved. And so what I'm imagining here is, because there's 4 people and because this document is really long and there's a lot of words about the taxations, different types of fees that are mentioned, a lot of economic terms in here, I just imagine that in Berga, this was a big enterprise, that there were a lot of people who worked adding color to textiles, and that this was a pretty significant part of the economic activity of the town of Berga. But, that's just all inference, of course. But I really just like having this window into the textile economy in Catalonia, because it kind of takes you into something that you can kind of imagine touching and feeling and seeing. So it's this sensory activity, the dye. Where did the dye come from? How was it all done? I just imagine like the stains on the fingers of the people. It's a document that brings you into life activity in a way that you don't always get to imagine when looking at the financial records. So, I don't know. I tend to just imagine that in there anyway, but sometimes it's nice to just be aware of how there were all these different kinds of artisanal enterprises all around the realm. All right, does this document relate to my research question about the cooperation between the institution of the queen and the institution of the king, or between the persons of the king and queen? I think yes. I think the mention of the king in this document in line 3, but it's a document written by the queen. I think we've got yet another instance of a level of cooperation. And of course, I think what we'd really have to do if we're trying to argue that this is unusual is we'd have to look at, we'd have to do a similar study of, say, the documents that appear in the registers of the queens during the reign of Pere the Ceremonious, and then also the register of Maria de Luna, the queen during the reign of Martí, which comes after Joan's reign. So I'm not going to argue that this was dramatically unusual, but we're just adding to the picture of what the cooperation would have looked like. And then, of course, when we then bring in the factor of Joan's sickliness That's when things get a little different. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.